Abrasion is the most common damage, leaving a gray residue inside the case. However, the shelter may still be usable. If you can't determine the condition of the shelter by looking through the vinyl bag, you can slit the bag along the bottom seam and remove the shelter to inspect it. Look for tears along folded edges, especially the sharply creased edges on the top and bottom. Also look for dents and punctures in the foil and remove any shelters with holes or tears greater than 1 inch. If the shelter is still usable, put it back in the plastic case with a signed and dated inspection tag. Reseal the case with glass tape. After you've inspected your fire shelter and okayed it for field use, there are several care and handling guidelines to follow. Keep your shelter away from sharp objects that may puncture it. Avoid as much rough handling as possible. Don't load heavy objects on top of fire shelters. Don't sit on it and use it as a pillow. Don't lean against objects when wearing the shelter. Now, to recap. To deploy the shelter, these are the main steps. Step 1 is to find a deployment area. A natural fuel break or light flashy fuel area is best. Be careful to stay away from high concentrations of fuel and nearby snags. Step 2, deploy your shelter before clearing an area, so your shelter is out and ready to use whenever you need it. Just yank the pull tab, take the shelter out of the vinyl bag, and open it up. Step 3, clear an area for your fire shelter, 4 feet by 8 feet, or larger if you have time. Lastly, get underneath your shelter. Once underneath your shelter, there are several things to remember. The number 1 priority throughout your entrapment is to protect your lungs and airways at all costs. Wear your hard hat, web gear, and gloves for added protection. Position your shelter so your feet are toward the flame front, taking the greatest amount of heat. Keep your nose to the ground to breathe the coolest, most smoke-free air. You can even dig out a small hole for your face to keep it even closer to the ground, and cover your face with a dry bandana. Maintain communication if possible by yelling to each other and by making radio contact with other firefighters. But always keep the correct position inside your shelter to protect your lungs and airways. Don't be reluctant to deploy your shelter. The monetary loss or embarrassment is insignificant compared to the time you lose by waiting too long. Once inside your shelter, stay there. Wait until a supervisor tells you to move or the flame front has passed. Don't take any chances that you'll leave your shelter too early and expose yourself to superheated air. The last step in fire shelter training is for you to practice what you've learned here, to be more confident in the fire shelter's ability to protect you and your ability to use it. Chances are you'll never have to use your fire shelter. I hope not. But if you do, you'll have a better chance of surviving a fire like this if you know when and how to use your fire shelter. During the 1985 fire season, severe fires burned throughout the country. These blazes forced several crews to deploy fire shelters. We now estimate the shelter has saved over 140 lives, and that number increases each year. The largest single entrapment occurred August 29, 1985, on the Salmon National Forest in Idaho. 73 firefighters deployed shelters in these safety zones on the Butte Fire. We estimate the shelter saved 60 lives on this fire alone. These firefighters were interviewed soon after their entrapment. Portions of these interviews follow to let you hear how they feel about the fire shelter.
We got to a point where we couldn't stay down there any longer. We all threw our fusees in the woods and ran down here where you can see the shelters. And I looked around to make sure my crew was popping their shelters. No one was running, and that everybody made sure they had gloves on and that they were getting in their shelters and as calmly as they could, trying to keep them calm. And the last thing I remember seeing before I went in was a wall of flame across this cat line, as far as I could see either way, into the smoke, and about 200, 300 feet high. Just all you could see was flame, and I ducked in my shelter.
And while in the shelter, you can expect winds in the 40 to 50 mile an hour range. While we were in there, it did get hot. Gloves were an absolute necessity as far as being able to hold the sides of the shelter down. In the strong winds, the shelter's going to flap. It's going to come down right over your head, and it's going to hit your back. It didn't seem to make any difference as far as its effectiveness.
During the time, though, you know, everybody was really scared because you didn't know what to expect. I think that was probably the worst thing about it, was just really didn't know what to expect. Once we were down and it hit us, we were pretty much talking to each other after it hit us, because when it did hit us, the noise was just, it was tremendous. You know, it was like all these jets just flying over you. So we were all just talking to each other, trying to get our mind off the fire and joking around as much as we could. You know, everybody knew, though, that it was pretty serious. You know, it was definitely a life and death matter.
About an hour later, when the smoke was kind of clearing up a little bit and the heat kind of went down a little bit, I tried to get a head count out of all the people, but I tried it 3-4 times and couldn't get it because the smoke kept coming.
One of the most important things that came out of this was that even though there are holes in these shelters, that they still worked. They, you know, there was ways to get around. If the hole was on the bottom, you could tuck it under you, or you could try to hold it shut. Or these little ones, you could feel the heat coming through, but you could move far enough away where it wouldn't hurt you. Even though the shelter was in bad shape, it still saved lives.
And the only thing I got to say for a fire shelter, treat them and treat them right. They save our life. Don't mistreat them. And make sure when you get a new person that they know how to use it. Don't just handle a fire shelter to an individual and expect him to use it. Give him some training. And don't mistreat it. Don't sit on a shelter, because you're going to put some creases in there. Because some of the shelters we had in here, they had rips in there, holes and everything, I guess for a misuse or a lot of use. So whatever you do, take care of that shelter. Don't walk around the woods without it. You save our life, you might save yours.
About the shelters, I'm here, you know, today because of them. I'm really convinced of that. They saved my life, and they saved the lives of my crew. I think when I die, I'll go to heaven, because I spent my time in hell right down there.